Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
I'm very good, Jamie. Thank you very much.
We're very much looking forward to today because we're lucky enough to welcome Alex Jinich onto the show. Alex is a PhD student of cognitive science at UC San Diego, where he studies the neuroscience of the mind-body approaches to pain, amongst other things. He's motivated to contribute to our understanding of meditation, of how meditation and other novel therapeutic techniques help reduce pain and improve well-being in general. Alex, thanks for being here, mate.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk pain because it's something that's like one of these inevitabilities. But with that said, there are ways to manage it. Now, we understand a couple of them. So we understand pharmaceutical drugs pretty well. We understand things like exercise can help release tension pretty well. But
Yeah,
meditation, it's in the community, people are beginning to understand it, but outside that, not at all. How the hell are they linked, meditation and pain?
great question. We're just starting to understand how they're linked, and to take a step back, pain itself is incredibly more complicated than it first appears. So the first useful distinction that we need to make is between pain and nociception. And basically,
Hmm.
nociception is everything that's happening below the neck, where you have these primary sensory afferents that are nociceptive that will start firing as a result of coming into contact with a noxious stimulus. And you have spinal mechanisms that don't require a brain that will, for example, trigger a reflex response. And so that's a very low level version of the same mechanisms that pain evolved in order to help us survive. However, whenever we start to talk about the experience of pain, we are automatically involving the brain. And pain is, by definition, a subjective experience. And so it's subject to these supraspinal cortical and cortical thalamic interactions that essentially produce this conscious experience that we call pain, and that can be modulated below the spine through, for example, these pharmacological treatments, which we understand pretty well, right, which act on the periphery. And However, it can also be modulated above the neck. And that's where meditation acts. And so we also know that there are many other cognitively triggered mechanisms that can modulate pain, starting from placebo, but also just conditioning, hypnosis, and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that I find most interesting about meditation and pain is that by injecting a very high dose of naloxone, which is an opioid antagonist, we've been able to determine that while the placebo effect acts via the brain's endogenous opioid system,
Hmm.
meditation does not. And it's not just placebo, right? Every other cognitively mediated pain relief mechanism has been demonstrated to be opioidergically mediated. So the brain
Whoa.
essentially produces our own endogenous painkillers that go down to the spinal cord, and they produce pain relief in an incredibly
And
powerful
and
fashion.
you're saying meditation doesn't do this. This isn't the route by which
Correct.
meditation does this. Or wow, interesting, very interesting. So you've got this bunch of data. You've got hard data from the body, but the pain itself is going to be an interpretation of that data. And
Yes.
right. And lots of ways that we've thought of above the neck pain relief are impacting opioid systems, but meditation isn't. It's so fascinating. So, what is meditation doing then, if it's not that?
So we're still very much investigating that. It's a very active area of research, but we believe that it has to do with changing the predictive mechanisms that that construct our conscious experience of moment to moment awareness. And so the idea is that we need to protect ourselves against noxious stimuli but we also need to do it in the most energetically and metabolically efficient manner. And what that means is that we're not only sensing the potential noxious stimuli, but we're also predicting that there will be that they will exist in a certain context based on our previous experience of the world and the correlations that exist in the world. And so so the overall final experience of the pain is the product of the combination of the nociceptive stimulus with the much higher level construction of the experience that is also informed by the prediction. And
So
so,
then, so then prediction isn't trying to get rid of necessarily. So I mean to say meditation isn't exactly trying to get rid of the data. Rather, it's changing its relationship with the data. It's changing its interpretation of the data rather than trying to get rid of the data. You think the opioids would be there to dampen the data, to make you feel better. But you're saying rather than deal with the data that way, you can do something else. The system can reinterpret what that data is all about.
absolutely, I think that what meditation does, and specifically mindfulness meditation, which is the one that we've studied in greatest depth, that what it's doing is it's essentially present centering the system and making it less prediction driven. And so that creates two effects. One is immediate, and it dampens the relative contribution of the prediction to the overall experience of pain. And so it makes your experience a lot more centered on just the actual ascending sensory information that is coming from the nociceptive sensors. And that is going to be lower than the combination of that plus the prediction of pain. And additionally, it's going to allow for the replacement of those predictions that can sometimes become chronically sticky, right? They will start predicting pain, sometimes not necessarily when there is a noxious stimulus, as in the case of chronic pain. And so it will allow for replacing them with more adaptive ones that are more closely coupled with the internal and external environment. I think also something very important to note is that when we're speaking about placebo effects and the opioidergic, the endogenous opioidergic system, it's not something that is off and that suddenly when we have a placebo response, it suddenly comes on and it necessarily hides data. It's always on. It's a set point that is dynamic. And so I think that's something that in medicine, the placebo effect has been very unfairly targeted as the enemy, and for good reason, right? In pharmacological clinical trials, it is sort of the thing that we need to beat in order to have these molecules prove their worth. But we forget that it is a dynamic set point, that the body is always adjusting a threshold over which there is a subjective experience of pain and under which there isn't, and that is done through this endogenous opioid system.
You said there that meditation makes the mind less predictive. What did you mean by that?
So the way I see it, the brain's main job is to be able to react to very weak physiological or sensory inputs while avoiding excitatory or inhibitory avalanches or suppression loops. So that's a technical way of saying that it needs to be maximally sensitive to very small perturbations, and at the same time, it needs to be resilient to them. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And so the way it does it is, instead of by moment to moment sensing every little piece of information that's coming from within the body and from the outside world, it is supplementing that by predicting it, by building an internal model of what all of those conditions, both inside and outside the body, are. And so, and that's much more metabolically efficient, right? Because by just predicting, then we can use sensory information to just correct compute the error between the prediction and what actually the information that is coming in is, and then correcting our model based on that. And so that's while it is incredibly efficient, it can also cause the system to fall into a um, a, a, a certain attractor or a certain set of predictions that are constantly, for example, predicting pain. And it makes sense for the organism to be biased towards predicting more pain rather than less pain, right? Because we're
Keeps
ultimately
you
trying
alive.
to optimize for, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Better to overestimate what kind of pain you're in than underestimate, because you might miss that you've been stabbed or shot or that you're being eaten, and you don't want to miss that. You don't want to miss that there's some problem. Yeah.
In other words, the body gets used to there being pain and starts predicting, oh, there should be pain here, which is metabolically effective, but actually has the effect psychologically of inducing pain that either isn't really there or wouldn't be as bad if not for the predictive system.
Absolutely. The brain cannot tell the difference between a prediction and a reality. It is the metaphor that I always use is if I'm holding a glass of water in my hand right now, the image that I'm getting, right, where the edges of the glass are very neat, are not actually the way that the information is coming in. The information itself, the sort of quote unquote true version of that is a lot noisier. It has a lot higher variance. And through a set of filters that are informed by all my previous instances of having held a glass and interacted with it before, that is how I am able to then clean up the image and experience it as a clean edge. And I think that that's the same thing that is happening at across hierarchical layers, and across different scales of features, and time and space. And that, it makes sense if you take, three steps back and you think that the way that the world is structured has an incredibly high amount of correlations in both time and in space, right? So if you choose any point in your visual field and you extract the color of it, there's an incredibly high probability that the point right next to it is going to be the same color, or a very similar color. And the same thing through time. It's very unlikely that the object that is right in front of you is going to suddenly be behind you. It's
Mm.
going to move, in a way that is highly correlated in time and space. And that is what allows you to be able to build a predictive system that is on that tends to be correct. And that saves a lot of energy by applying it. And so that's why that's sort of the logic behind why we can build a system that is biased towards predictions and mostly stay out of trouble.
Is there a worry then that mindfulness meditation, like anything that you're using to sort of reduce the impact of predictions and to up your experience of the driving signal more purely, is there a worry that you lose a bunch of the optimization and efficiency that evolution has sort of installed in us by having those high level predictions do their work? Because there is a lot of efficiency with being able to predict well. Can we bend that the wrong way, where now we're getting too much volatility from the world and we're not extracting the noise? So then we're having now what kind of background anxiety experiences where there's too much noise and we don't know what to do with all the noise. I wonder.
I think that's a great question, and I do think that there is some evidence, phenomenological, to suggest that meditative experiences can be quite um, anxiety provoking, and they're, the picture is not always super therapeutic and rosy, but that's in the short term. I think in the long term, barring um, some very small exceptions with psychopathology, in general, what we want and what living systems do in order to regulate themselves is oscillate. And and we
Mm.
see that across all of these different scales. And I think that what the way in which I see the therapeutic benefit of meditation, and specifically with regards to pain, is that by pushing it to a state that is much more flexible, where you can have
Yeah.
this much faster replacement of the predictions, then you can always circle back to a more predictive driven state, but with these new predictions, and you will. And so the more the system oscillates, the healthier it will be, because it will have a tighter coupling with its reality, internal and
I love
external.
that. I love that. That sounds right to me too. That you don't want meditation to leave you homogenous. You don't want to turn your mind into yogurt. You don't only do one thing. You want to be able to make sure that's more flexible, more adaptive, more dynamic. So what you're doing in meditation in part is you're learning to come down closer to the sensory edge, and also sometimes just let go and let it be deeply predictive. I mean, in the case of pain, you still want to be able to predict where the problems are, but when it's fierce and out of control, and you have good evidence that maybe it's not tracking real noxious signals, then you want the ability to be able to drop your attentional dynamics down to the edge to get better evidence, to update those models, and then to go back to status quo. It's great.
I mean, one quick thing that I'd like to add that I forgot earlier is that the other thing that pain contributes to, physiologically, that nociception does not, is an affective component, which is also happening mostly in the cortex, right? And what that does is it introduces the sphere of suffering. It's not just that we feel an experience that is painful, or that has, for example, that is localized in a part of the body and is acute, and that causes us aversion, but it also has a profoundly affective component, right? Which builds up this suffering quality. And if we go back to the early Pali scriptures, in Buddhism, they say that when an untrained person comes into contact with a noxious stimulus, it's as if he were hit by two darts. One is the sensation of pain, and the second one is the suffering that comes with it. And yet, if one is a trained meditator, then one is only hit by the first one, but not by the second one. And that's very much what we see in our psychophysical studies, is that after just a brief training, less than 80 minutes of mindfulness meditation training, the affective component of pain dramatically decreases. And so
Wow.
the other thing that this is doing is it's separating these two spheres. And in that way, we can still remain sensitive to the things that may hurt us, without necessarily falling into suffering because of them.
Yeah, because you're not getting rid of valence here. It's not like you don't know that there's a problem. It's just the elaboration of the problem is being reduced.
Exactly.
What's a practical example of that second dart?
A practical example of the second dart of suffering, I think, is a great example is chronic pain. I think chronic pain is has an incredibly important emotional component, where it is intimately connected to rumination, to catastrophizing, to the sense that the pain ceases to be a localized problem in a certain part of the body, and it grows to encompass our whole life, and not just in the present, but our whole future. And you see psychologically that sufferers begin to adopt their pain as part of their core identity. And they begin to identify with the pain, and to feel that it is something that becomes inescapable, and it starts to color every single sphere of their lives.
Do we have any evidence whether, like, an identification with pain? So if someone describes their life in terms of pain, whether that actual description has some effect on the predictive modeling of your brain? Does your brain get tighter on its predictions if we colloquially identify with something?
That's a fantastic question, and I don't know if there's a, a study that has asked it in such a punctual way, and if there isn't, there absolutely must be. But I have an incredibly strong feeling that the answer is going to be yes, and a resounding yes. I think there's definitely evidence that is in across multiple sensory modalities that suggests that absolutely high level concepts and conceptualizations of self will have an incredibly determining effect on our on the phenomenology, on the moment to moment conscious experience. So I would not be surprised at all that this translates to pain. And there is an incredibly powerful recent study. It was a randomized clinical trial where a great number of participants were randomized to and these were, I believe, chronic low back pain sufferers, and they were randomized to a treatment as usual group and to a type of pain reconceptualization therapy, where
Okay.
essentially they were given scientific evidence so that they would rethink the locus of their pain as something that is in their brains, and instead of located somewhere in the body. And they were also told that the brain is an inherently plastic organ, and so that you can change it. And just that had an absolutely dramatic effect, where the treatment as usual group, I think, had and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but like the usual dismal um, rate of pain relief and of remission. And yet the group that just essentially changed how they conceptualized pain dramatically changed their experience. And these are double
Whoa.
digit percentage
Whoa.
numbers of difference.
I teach a little bit on these predictive dynamics. It's sort of my bag in the cognitive science world. That just seems like such a great way to start every talk. Be like, hey, by the way, just informing you that the brain is a prediction machine and that you're making up some of your reality from the top down. Just by telling you that and then reminding you that these predictions are totally fluid, which means your life is updatable, it's going to potentially even have a bang on effect to your well being. Just seems like a great way to start a talk. That's awesome. Wow.
My flatmate at the minute is like, he's suffering with like maybe arthritis, they don't know, knees, hands, fingers, toes. And he's worried that it's something more serious, which is kind of why it's painful. Because we said today, if you were guaranteed it's going to last for another month and you'd never see it again, how sore would it be? It's
You
like,
wouldn't even
oh,
notice it.
if you find like, if you're fine. As opposed to now, where it's like hobbling around, like, fuck, this is painful.
Yeah.
It's just,
Absolutely. And yeah, yeah. I think the the way that I think of these predictive dynamics are they're self-fulfilling predictions, right? And that, I think, is scientifically really interesting to think about a structure that self-fulfills, and at the same time tremendously scary, right? And
Yeah.
and and when you think about, I mean, it's terrifying, because it means that that the what your thoughts actually matter, and they matter profoundly. And we are on a, we're systems that, it's almost like we've been fooled by this Newtonian bias towards equilibrium, and we forget that we are, trajectory dependent. And so it's very different when you're in the first month of of a condition like this than, when you've been suffering for years, because those predictions are going to be a lot more ingrained, and that's going to have an effect on the body. It doesn't just stay in the mind. It is going to have
Yeah.
a complete positive feedback loop. And so, yeah, um, it's just to say that it's incredibly exciting, but it's also,
I mean, this
it
is
can be quite
probably a
scary.
little bit far abreast for our conversation today, but it does make me remember that the sort of victimization stories that we see rolling around today can be really potentially harmful as well. I mean, it's good to appreciate when people are downtrodden, but at the same time, getting too much of these expectations that you're a downtrodden person can have the potentially harmful effect of tuning up the world and tuning up your experiences to confirm for you yet again that you're in a position where you're in danger, where the belief of being in danger makes you have the experience of being in danger, which of course underlies and fuels your experience of being in danger, which has to be really considered and worked with carefully. I know that's not exactly what we're talking about today, but it reminds me again how much my own beliefs of where I'm being harmed in my life matter for the way that I go forward in dealing with that harm.
Absolutely. I think that is absolutely spot on. And I think there's an incredibly fertile opportunity opening up in the world of cognitive science to think about these predictive dynamics and specifically these predictions as not existing in a void, right? Now
Yeah,
we
right,
understand and
right.
that it's the importance of culture and not culture as this just unknown that we're going to put outside of the models, but as the substrate through which these predictive dynamics exist and are adopted by people, and they exist in an arena, in a sort of marketplace of ideas or of predictions that is subject to competition and to hierarchies, and they will have an absolutely profound effect on your body, let alone your mind, right?
Imagine now that we've got pain linked up with culturally extended predictive dynamics, then how important is it that we're choosing the right kinds of information that we're taking in, the right chat channels to be a part of, the right people that we're following on social media, the right ideas we're allowing to get like into our lives? Because like you've just said, even your cultural apparatus is going to have some impact potentially on the way that you interpret signals that otherwise could either be painful or not. Something like pain, which is so serious and so real for us, to think that that could be even culturally embedded, culturally extended, is huge. It's a huge point.
Yep, absolutely. I think one fun data point, which I love mentioning, and a lot of people hate when they listen to it, um,
Right.
which just makes me love it even more, is the fact that the placebo effect is not constant through time, and so if it's actually grown in magnitude, and so if we were to repeat many of the pharmacological clinical trials that were done decades ago, given what we know about the current magnitude of the effect, many of those molecules would no longer make the cut today. And of course, you have the big controversy erupts when this sort of data starts to filter out, and there's a group of people that say no, it's statistically it's a statistical anomaly. It's the way we're measuring it that is causing the error, and so we don't need to worry about it. And then, which is usually the response that people have when we have no idea what's happening, where our theories and tools just don't allow us to understand the phenomenon. What I think is happening is, when you look further into the data, you see that in the United States, this effect is much more pronounced than in the rest of the world. And you can connect that with the notion that the United States is the one country where pharmaceutical marketing expenditures are not capped by law. And so people are exposed to a lot more advertisings for specific compounds, right? For pharmacological compounds. And so it would make sense that people already have an idea. You go to the doctor and you already know what you want. And so the placebo effect is already active, and then just getting the prescription is just the last link that actually triggers the process, right? But there's a whole invisible mechanism that is there. And yeah, this is sort of a bit farther out than
No, I
we were
feel like it would
originally.
be a great book. I mean, we can move on, but it would be a great book, like how pharmaceutical movements are all wrapped up with our belief networks. Wow.
You also said something a while ago, which I'm gonna pivot on here. But you said we're trajectory dependent, and it's wild, right? Because you can have an idea of an exciting project you want to do, and you're already buzzing. It doesn't actually require even doing it yet. You're clued into the future trajectory. And equally, like, we've all had the feeling of, like, I don't know, you could do a PhD, and you go, well, objectively, that's quite high up the ladder in terms of academia, but you have a bad day, it doesn't feel good anymore. We're not assessing how things are, we're assessing how things are going to be for the next X number of months. That's a wild, that's one of those thoughts with quite a few direct implications for how you should go about your life.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it really, um, it really throws a lot of weight on how we construct our lives based on how we construct our futures, and how those are, in turn, affected by everything around us, starting with the people that you surround yourself with, and um, with the beliefs that are present in the culture around you. So I think that, regardless of whether those beliefs are adaptive or less adaptive, I think that these contemplative practices that allow your system to oscillate between being more grounded in them and floating a little bit into a more flexible state is going to help you choose, because you're always choosing between a population of different predictions, and this is happening, consciously and unconsciously across, every single scale of the sensory hierarchy. And so I think having these moments, which are not just, I think, limited to meditation, right? I think they can be induced through a lot of other states, but meditation is an incredibly powerful, very straightforward way in which you're specifically targeting this. And its effects on pain are it's just, pain is such a simple universal experience that is at once so complicated, and it's just very clear when we see it in work in pain, right? And we have some paradigms where, for example, we can cause people pain in the lab with noxious heat. And so 49 degrees Celsius is the magic number where it causes no harm, but it will, it hurts a lot, and it will feel like you're really being burned. And yeah, these things are fun to play around with, but
Science.
and um, and so, you can there are a lot of experimental paradigms with this, and one of them is you can give people a clinically very relevant dose of intravenous morphine, and we've shown that mindfulness meditation is more effective. It essentially
Whoa.
reduces the intensity of pain to a greater extent than the normal clinical doses of intravenous opioids, which is absolutely insane.
How?
How is it doing it? So we know that it's doing it through um, cortical-thalamic cortical interaction. So we know that it's at a very high level, and we've also shown that meditation and mindfulness meditation specifically increases the entropy of the brain, right? So it causes the brain to be in a less prediction-driven state, in a in a you could say in a more chaotic state in sort of layman's terms. But essentially, what we think is happening is that the degree to which the system is assigning precision to ascending sensory signals versus to the predictions, right? So there's a certain weight that is assigned to either a prediction or to the nociceptive information coming from the noxious stimuli, in order to inform moment to moment experience, right? And when you're meditating, you're shifting over that balance so that it's more sensory weighted and less prediction weighted. And that mechanism is believed to be generally modulated by the global excitation to inhibition balance across the cortex. So the degree to which the overall population of excitatory versus inhibitory currents is balanced will essentially change the extent to which the system is more or less prediction driven. And this itself has been shown to be sensitive to a specific type of circuit between the thalamus and the cortex. And so there's some very interesting work that shows, all of our understanding of sensory systems is incredibly biased towards the visual system, because that's where all the the neuroscience has been built from vision outwards, and that's very much, I think, it's great, but it's also an incredibly problematic bias. And so the classic example is to see, the retina, and then there's the optic nerve, and you get to a subthalamic nuclei called the LGN, and from there the nucleus is a relay that just projects that information back to visual cortex, to V1, where it's processed, and so the thalamus acts as a relay, and that's just half the story. Many of the other thalamic nuclei actually have a very different type of projection to the cortex, which is a matrix type projection. It's a diffuse connection that goes to multiple places in the cortex. And that type of traffic is always happening. Both types of traffic are always happening. And not just that, but there are many more connections coming down from the cortex back into the thalamus than they are going up in the first place. And so it's a constant loop that is modulated by attention. And so what I think is happening is that when we are practicing open monitoring type meditation, so more vipassana type of mindfulness, what we're doing is we're modulating attention in a way that is pushing the balance between relay or core type connectivity versus matrix or diffuse type connectivity much more to the diffuse side. So we're being non-judgmentally, openly aware of all sorts of stimuli coming from within the body and from outside the body. And that matches really well with a much more diffuse style of connectivity. And we know that that increases the excitation to inhibition balance across the entire cortex, and in turn that makes the system less prediction driven, more attuned to ascending sensory information. So that's a handful, but that's what I think is the mechanism. And
that's how it works. Wow, amazing. Great research.
How do we build up this is the practical edge. How do we build up our meditation abilities so we can get some of that good stuff running in the background?
I think that's an excellent question. And what we've seen in our studies is that you really only need very, very little practice in order to have a very profound effect, right? You don't need to be a monk and to lock yourself in a cave for years. But with what we do is we recruit meditation naive participants, which has been getting progressively more difficult, especially in California, but that's a separate conversation. But we basically give them 4 20-minute sessions of mindfulness meditation instruction, and after that we see these very, very, very high magnitude effects that I've been describing. And so I think the first thing to understand is you don't need to be an expert, and there's really no destination. And I know this is very much the Eastern, it's been it's well understood, and it's repeated ad nauseum, but it really is true. It's more about the actual practice of it than about any type of feeling that you are going to produce with it. It really isn't about getting to any place. It's actually sitting down and spending however many minutes a day doing it is really causing the brain to oscillate to this different state. And it is the process of oscillating, of moving from and to this different state, that is going to help you. And so even if you don't feel that it is in the moment causing a change, it really is. And so you do need to have a little bit of that discipline and that belief that it's going to work, but not too much, because we've shown that it's incredibly effective, and you only need a few minutes of instruction. So I think it's pretty promising.
What's the drawback of doing only 80 minutes? Like, if you compare the results you get from those guys versus the hour-a-day meditators, like where do you get diminishing returns?
That's a great question, and I don't think we have a really comprehensive dose response curve across a really well-studied different doses. But we do know that I would venture to say that at least for pain relief, we are seeing incredibly profound reductions with very little instruction, but it's not the instruction that counts, it's the practice, right? And so what we've seen across the board in these different studies is it's not so much a measure of how long you practice every day as much as that you practice every day, right? And so we do know that that's the key ingredient. And in terms of time practicing, I mean, our participants do it for 20 minutes a day, and that seems to be, I think, a dose that will maximize the effect while minimizing the time. I don't think that if we cut it down, you're going to see that big of an effect, and if you double it, I don't think you're going to see double the effect.
Wow. I'd love to see that research. I'd love to see what long-term experts who are practicing 16 hours a day or something do in the same sort of situation. I would just love to see that. But I love the like good news of 20 minutes a day gives you a profound reduction in the kind of pain you experience. It's just such a wonderful take home.
Yeah, I think, I mean, to get into a little bit more detail with your question, we always collect two types of pain ratings. We collect pain intensity, which is trying to track the sensory quality, right? As if, you know, if pain is a radio, it's how loud the volume is. And then the pain unpleasantness, which tries to capture the more affective suffering-based component. So how much are you bothered by the pain? And what we see is that with relatively low doses of meditation, both go down very, very significantly. But when somebody is a much more practiced, seasoned meditator, then the intensity component tends to go down less. And yet the affective component remains incredibly low, right? And so you cease to be bothered by the noxious stimulus, and you become more able to actually feel it without necessarily suffering from the experience. And so we believe that there might actually...
Yeah, you're getting more interceptive information because you're an expert. So you're getting more pain-related info, but you're equally non-perturbed by it.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we believe that there might actually be different neural mechanisms that are being recruited for short-term versus longer-term practice.
Nice.
But that remains to be proven.
Cool.
Alex, awesome, man. Where can everybody find you online?
Good question. So I have a website that is Alejandro Jinich Diamant, which is my full name.com. And that's where usually I have most of my things, but you can also find me on email and Instagram, Alex Jinich, alexjinich@gmail.com.
Alex, thanks so much, mate. That was awesome.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
I hope everyone at home had as much fun listening as we did recording, and as always, we'll see you next week.